Person-centered therapy is much more than reflecting or just being a mirror. It's about helping the person truly understand themselves fully and accurately, and therefore become the absolute best that they can be. Welcome to The Art of Therapy, Season 3, Episode 10.
It's good to be back here with you and just further exploring the art of therapy.
It is, yes.
So just to recap a bit on the last episode, so we really started to dive into the humanistic approach, and of course started with Abraham Maslow, and just understanding how he had such a profound impact on psychology and understanding human beings. Where he moved the shift to understanding healthy human beings and the importance of growth and what pushes people towards growth. So really, in essence, self-actualizing.
I think his approach is so exciting because, as you note, he began to look at those who are really fulfilled, really achieving and expressing their utmost. Up until that time, the focus had been really trying to help people, and much of the learnings were from those in therapy, in hospitals, those experiencing great distress. But we just see in him how, and it's again, life is balance. On the one hand, we learn from helping suffering. On the other, from achievement, fulfillment, states of peak states, inspiration. And yes, that's where he went. And as we looked at that, he had spent time with and really tried to understand and interact with those certainly who were living at the time, but anyone who was really expressing meaningfully their potential. And of course, going back to those who've contributed. But the point was that focusing on those who experience health, those who are inspired, those who are achieving, and his whole work orientated around that. And today we see those developments where one of the most remarkable ways to understand human functioning and a person and development is to talk to them, to understand what makes them tick. Why do they do what they do? What are their learnings? How do they distill that knowledge, and the ability then to model that? That's incredible. So we see with Maslow this approach, and what a creative, exceptional contribution.
He really showed what motivates people and what drives them.
Yes. Well, this is so important because really what he was articulating is shedding the light on and bringing so clearly is what motivates us. And how is this happening? And I think we looked at that often he's understood in terms of his hierarchy of needs. But all of that, it's really important, but it's all around motivation. And he was really showing us that those first four levels, as it were, effectively the biological, the safety, and then looking at love and affiliation and esteem, those four really are around needs that relate to deficiency. And when they cannot be met, there's the individual orientates around them at one or more levels. But once those are being managed and being met in some way, now one can go into the growth need, which is actualization. And that's the whole drive. For the individual to actualize, to become more of who they are. So he set out an incredible construct and a way of understanding what really motivates us as people, as human beings, and this in interaction with our environment.
He really created a different lens that we can actually view human behavior.
Yes, very much. And so strong that's why he's understood as really the founder of the third force, or the humanistic approach, because this help to understand the human being as a person, in terms of our motivation and what we're all about. And his work, I think, in later years was expressed in other areas. We know in positive psychology, it's often being a founding work, and it's understandable because he was taking such important concepts that we can all learn about: motivation, what inspires us, and we can apply them meaningfully in our lives.
Yeah, it's so profound, and I think we can do even more time on him. But we also did say that we'll look at some of the other aspects of humanistic theory, and of course the next one is Carl Rogers, and we did say that we'll have a look at how do Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, how do they work together?
Yes. Okay. Right. So let's go there.
Okay.
In one way, we could use this sort of analogy, where what we see with Maslow, because it's really all around motivation, and he shows us what we're orientating around, which is actualization, self-actualisation, becoming the most of who we can be and striving for that. Maslow, by analogy, gives us our destination, where we're headed. But it's really in Carl Rogers who now starts to look at more of the how. And the how of it is something of that vehicle that gets us to our destination. And this is where Carl Rogers comes in. He really shows us the how of it, actually starts to look at it very, very carefully. And what are the qualities necessary for us to reach that destination? What is needed for actualization and self-actualization, and understanding this really quite specifically, if not quite exquisitely at times, because it was understanding the person, the human being.
I think it's beautiful to see how they fit together. And it's that we have one theorist that actually identified the where to and what's our destination.
Yes.
But then, of course, we need the how.
Indeed.
And starting to look at that. So yes. I think if we need to understand how they work together, we need to understand a bit more of the specific theory.
Yes.
So maybe if we can start to explore the Carl Rogers a bit more.
Yes. All right. So what Carl Rogers really looks at is, as part of the humanistic approach, that we're all self-actualized. We're all actualizing, becoming the most of who we can be. That's what we're striving towards. And what he explained is the way this comes about is that we have to, and we experience, and we have a perception of our environment, the physical environment, those around us. But what Rogers explained is it's subjective. And that is part of our perception. And that is the only perception, our subjective perception of the world around us. And then the meaning that we attach to that. So he said this subjective experience and the meaning we attach is part of our phenomenal field. And hence, that's why it's part of phenomenology, because of the emphasis on perception, subjective experience, and then the meaning we attach. And what Rogers explained then is that from birth, we experience the environment and others, which is our total phenomenal field and our experiencing. But at some point in our development, we begin to develop a view or a perception of ourselves, which he said is very much our self-concept. So it now has a distinction. I'm not just experiencing the world. I now have a view of myself, which is separate in interaction with the world.
That's actually two separate things.
Yes, exactly. And this self-concept is then how we view ourselves, but moreover, what values we attach to that. What does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's actually, it's one of his biggest contributions is understanding the self-concept and how we view ourselves and, like you say, the values that we attach to that.
Yes. In many ways, it could be considered a theory on the self-concept and a construct. A lot of emphasis is drawn and placed on the nature and quality of relationship, which is key, but often not understanding what it was about in terms of the self-concept. And what he was explaining was that if we didn't have a self-concept, in effect, we would just experience the environment and become increasingly more and more of who we are as we develop. But when we have a self-concept, that is something that's separate.
Okay.
And there's certain things that affect the way we see ourselves. And what he explained is that, and drawing on Maslow, is that there's a core underlying tendency, the tendency towards actualization, the actualizing tendency. And then he identified a second part to that, which is it's guidance from the self-concept about how we actualize, which is called the self-actualising tendency. And when we actualize ourselves and our understanding of ourselves is accurate, our self-concept and the way we see ourselves actually corresponds to who we are, how we're experiencing the world. When that corresponds, when it's accurate, what he explained was that that's how we express more of who we are. We self-actualize.
Psychotherapy is not only a profession, it's a state of being. And for that, it requires continuous learning, training, and refining your skills. If you would like to become better in your role as a psychotherapist, come and join Dr. Warwick Phipps for in-person training at Treatment Work Centre, where you will experience training like never before from a thought leader and expert in psychotherapy. If you would like some more information on our training or to book a training session, please visit the link in the description. And also, if you find these podcast episodes meaningful, please subscribe to The Art of Therapy. It's actually understanding both of those aspects. It's about our self-concept and then how we understand ourselves in the environment.
Yes.
And when we have the same messages, how we see ourselves and how others sees us, and they work together and they fit together, then we are self-actualized.
Yes, exactly. If that was the only aspect, then life would be so much easier in a way. We would much more readily self-actualize because our self-concept and our experience of ourselves, to the extent that corresponds with who we are, our abilities, our experiences, and that's accurate, we would inevitably and just naturally express, become more of who we are. The challenge is that what he identified further is we then have two other essential needs.
Okay.
And that is the need for positive regard, and it's a positive regard from others. That we need to be valued. We've noted this in an earlier episode, that we need to know that we matter to others, that we're valued, that somehow who and what we are counts for something, that we're appreciated, respected, that there's something to us being here. So we have a deep need for positive regard from others. We also have a need for positive self-regard, that we need to experience ourselves as meaningful, as contributing, as having a place, not only what other people tell us, but that deep down we have a sense of valuing ourselves, this positive regard, positive self-regard. Now, the challenge is that as we are growing up, what Carl Rogers explained is that there can at times be in an interaction a conflict between how we see ourselves and the kind of messages that we receive in the environment, especially when the messages we receive are ones of conditional worth, conditional acceptance. You're only good enough when, you're not good enough if.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens to the individual is that they've got to try and manage, on the one hand, coming to understand themselves, developing an accurate self-concept, and at the same time, try to maintain positive regard from those around them and positively regard themselves. Wow.
That is actually extremely complex.
Yes. Yes.
And it is, if your self-concept, if it's difficulty there, you won't self-actualize.
Right.
But also then, if you don't have unconditional positive regard from your environment, it will also be hard.
Exactly. This is why it's such a challenge, because yes, in the first instance, one has to accurately understand oneself to be more of who we are. And if the person receives judgment for being that person, for expressing themselves in that way, in order to maintain and to preserve that relationship, and we need our relationships, very often that person will have to distort their experience of themselves. They'll have to either deny certain parts or expressions of who they are. They have to find a way of preserving the relationship with those around them, their significant others that Rogers referred to them as, and at the same time develop their self-concept. But to the extent that it's very strong, that judgment about what makes them worthwhile or worthy, is very often the extent to which someone has to limit their understanding of themselves, either deny or distort or ignore aspects of who they are. And therefore, Carl Rogers explained that they were in a state of incongruence. Their self-concept and their understanding of themselves doesn't actually match and correspond with their experience and who they are. And therefore they can't actualize. Well, they're blocked. Yeah. So that's the one part. The other part is, yes, as you noted, if one just really just expresses and develops a view of oneself and expresses that and completely disregards meaningful relationships and the value that others ascribe, that can be extremely isolating and it can be extremely painful, because we need meaningful relationships. And so that too is not going to be effective. So life is this balance, and development involves developing meaningful relationships and knowing that I'm valued, I'm regarded, positive self-regard, and that means a great deal to me. So there's positive self-regard, and it accurately corresponds to who I am and my process of becoming the best version of me. That's a challenge, and that's what we all face. And how to do this.
It's actually, it's so refreshing to hear this, a bit of a different interpretation, a different view on Carl Rogers, because we a lot of people, we understand the empathy, the congruence, the unconditional positive regards, but understanding these two sides of the value, your self-concept, and how you need to become more of who you are, while actually having the positive regard from others, and how to manage and have that vehicle for both of them. That is actually very complex.
Yes. And I agree with you. That's when one understands it, just as you've explained, it again just highlights why the thinking is so important, because it's the nature and quality of those relationships are really important, and they're important therapeutically. But how come? And what does it mean for the person? What's actually happening? And that's really why one of the main goals within a person-centered therapeutic approach is to create a safe environment, a very special kind of therapeutic relationship, so that a person can begin to understand themselves for who they are, begin to see themselves, know themselves, and effectively correct and heal that understanding of themselves, the distorted self-concept. And the moment you can know yourself more meaningfully, more fully, so often you will just know where to head. You will know what to do. But it requires that deeper understanding, that about oneself. And that's really what Rogers was looking at, how the individual, how the person can begin to understand themselves more accurately for who they are, and therefore give expression to that congruently in the world and self-actualize.
Then it just all it just fits together, and that just creates really a pathway to self-actualization.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's such as, because everything then for the individual, once the individual and the person just knows themselves, they can see just how very often to give expression. And with that, there's often profound creativity, deep, authentic, congruent expression. And paradoxically, not always, as the individual often self-actualize, expresses more of who they are, the nature and quality of their relationships can improve, and where they're celebrated for becoming more of who they are. Not always, because sometimes there can be rejection and continued pain, but then in part of the process of self-actualization, the individual would need to reconsider how to respond, what to do about those relationships. But it's a much more empowered position to do it from, when you truly understand yourself and you're giving expression more and more of who you are. Then managing and finding ways of managing those relationships and figuring them out is also more, it's easier, it's more comfortable.
It becomes clearer.
It does, much clearer.
And I think with that, it shows how come the person-centered approach plays such a big role in psychology, and in understanding that part, it's why we still use the person-centered approach.
Yes.
And it's come a long way since then, but it's still so meaningful and so powerful.
Yes. What we now understand, and that's why, yes, as you say, it forms, really it's foundational, and it's for any therapeutic approach, because there are two qualities that are quite remarkable once one understands this. The first is that just someone understanding more of who they truly are will enable them to accomplish things and actualize in ways that they could never have anticipated. And so much of therapy, it's not a statistic, it's more by analogy, but at least 60 to 70% of therapy, if that therapeutic relationship enables and helps someone understand themselves clearly, what they can accomplish, resolve, is quite something. So much of therapy involves assisting and helping someone to understand themselves more meaningfully, deeply, clearly. So that is transformative in and of itself. And then the second quality is recognizing, well, what creates that context? What kind of interaction, what kind of relationship do we need in order to better understand ourselves, to more clearly see ourselves, and to begin to actualize and self-actualize? And that's really where he explained that, as we've noted in previous episodes, that first of all, one has to be in interaction and relating to someone where how they're relating is trustworthy, that it's authentic, that it's true. and consistent. And once we experience that, we can trust immediately there's safety with that. And so really that comes down to the other person's congruence. When they're congruent and genuine, authentic, in effect, there's trust. And then when someone shows really deep understanding, which is really accurate empathy, and then that is, of course, without any judgment, and that understanding is conveyed with a deep and positive regard. That is, and the relationship in which someone can thrive, understand themselves, understand their experience, their abilities, their sense of who they are, and give expression ultimately to becoming the most that they can be.
They can really then show themselves and self-actualize.
Yes.
I feel like we can actually spend even so much more time on this, and it really is a profound area of understanding human beings. I think if we pause it here, and maybe another part of the humanistic theory is also looking at another theorist, Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
And understanding his part and his contribution to the humanistic theory.
That is so important, because if we just take Carl Rogers, it's hard to conceptualize of any meaningful therapeutic approach that doesn't in some way have some person-centered basis or element, because of how powerful it is. When we now consider that contribution and what it means for us as psychotherapists today, what is now added, as you note, is Viktor Frankl's work, because in a sense, Viktor Frankl begins to explore, what if we can't have the nature and quality of relationship? What happens if we have absolutely no control over our environment, the relationships that we're in, and we're faced with enormous distress, there's pain, there's terror? What is a human being doing, and what can we access that enables us to cope, to find meaning, to transcend? So yes, this is something that is of the utmost importance.
So let's look at that the next time then.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for joining us on The Art of Therapy. If you found this episode meaningful, or if it expanded your knowledge, we would love to hear from you in the comments section. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until our next episode.